The steady beeping beside Eleanor Cole's hospital bed had been fading for hours, softening into longer pauses, until it finally flattened into one unbroken tone. 3:42 p.m. That was the official time St. Joseph Medical Center recorded her passing. But for Marion Cole, the moment had arrived far earlier, somewhere in the long night she had spent holding Eleanor's weakening hand, listening to the quiet breaths grow shallower in the dim light of the room. Marion stood alone. There were voices in the hallway, rolling carts, visiting families offering comfort to one another, but none of that warmth belonged to her. Her husband, Alex, had never shown up. His sister, Stephanie, hadn't called. No one from the Cole family had bothered to check in, not even out of courtesy. The only human presence beside Marion was a nurse whose face carried both exhaustion and a gentle kind of kindness that couldn't be faked. The nurse stepped closer, adjusting the blanket around Eleanor one final time before turning to Marion with a look of genuine sympathy. She pressed a small, slightly wrinkled envelope into Marion's hand. "She asked us repeatedly to make sure this goes to you," the nurse said softly. "Only after now." For a moment, Marion couldn't bring herself to open it. She stood in the quiet room, the hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the lingering echo of the flatline. Eventually, she tore the envelope open with trembling fingers. Inside lay an old silver key, tarnished around the edges, and a slip of paper bearing an address deep within the Washington forest. Under it, written in Eleanor's distinct, careful handwriting, was a single sentence: "They never loved me. Let them learn what it means to be forgotten." The words chilled Marion more than the sterile air of the room ever could. She closed the envelope and slipped it into her coat pocket. When she stepped out into the hallway, the hospital felt louder, brighter, as though the world were already moving past Eleanor's death. Marion walked slowly toward the exit, her steps heavy, her chest hollow. Something had shifted, permanently, irrevocably, and she felt it settle inside her as she pushed open the doors and stepped into the gray Tacoma afternoon. Marion didn't start the car right away. She sat motionless in the driver's seat, hands still resting on the wheel, staring through the windshield as the late afternoon light shifted across the hospital parking lot. She could feel the envelope with the key in her coat pocket, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight. For nearly half an hour, she remained there, silent, stunned, and unbearably alone. Shock settled over her like a damp Pacific Northwest fog, thick and unmoving. When she finally drove away from St. Joseph Medical Center, the world outside seemed muted, as though every sound had been wrapped in cotton. By the time she reached her neighborhood in Tacoma, her phone began vibrating in the cup holder. She glanced at the screen. Alex. For a moment, she considered letting the call ring out, but exhaustion won, and she swiped to answer. "Hey," Alex said, his voice casual, distracted, almost cheerful. "Are you still out? If you're stopping somewhere, can you grab milk and maybe some bread? I didn't get a chance to go earlier." Marion closed her eyes. Her grip tightened around the phone. "Alex," she said, her voice flat, almost expressionless. "Your mother died today, at 3:42. There was a pause, a long one, but not the kind that carried grief. More like the sound of a man switching mental gears because the conversation had veered into something inconvenient. "Oh," he finally said. "Well, I had meetings. You know how things are. We'll figure out the arrangements later. Just get home when you can." His dismissiveness slid into Marion's chest like a blade she'd already felt too many times. It didn't surprise her. That somehow made it hurt more. She ended the call without another word. When she walked through their front door later that evening, the house felt colder than before, unwelcoming, hollow, as if it were only pretending to be a home. Alex wasn't there. A game replay murmured from the living room TV, left running from the night before. Marion lay awake long after midnight, unable to rest. The silence pressing against the walls felt different now. not peaceful, just empty. She realized she had crossed a threshold she couldn't step back over. Whatever her life had been before that day, it wasn't hers anymore. Dawn had barely touched the sky when Marion pulled out of her driveway, the forested highway stretching ahead like a quiet summons she couldn't ignore. The address Eleanor had written on that small slip of paper didn't belong to any place Marion recognized. It led her away from Tacoma, past misty evergreens and winding back roads, deeper into the secluded stretches of the Olympic Peninsula. As the miles passed, the pavement narrowed until it gave way to a rough, overgrown path. Branches brushed the sides of her car, tapping softly against the windows as though the forest itself were testing her resolve. The trees thickened, draped in moss, their shadows weaving across the ground in long, shifting patterns. Marion kept driving, her pulse slow but steady, guided only by the coordinates Eleanor had insisted she receive after her death. Eventually, the path opened into a small clearing, and there it was, a faded cabin tucked beneath towering firs and tangled wild roses. Time had worn down the paint, leaving muted streaks of gray and green. But the structure stood solid, almost stubbornly so, like it had been waiting for someone. Marion stepped outside, the air cool and damp, carrying that familiar Pacific Northwest scent of cedar and rain. Her boots pressed into soft earth as she approached the front door. When she pulled the old key from her coat pocket, it felt strangely warm in her hand. The lock turned without resistance. Inside, the cabin breathed with the scent of lavender, dust, and old wood. Sunlight filtered through clouded windows, casting a soft haze across shelves lined with worn books. Nothing felt abandoned. Instead, the space seemed preserved, like a memory Eleanor had kept safe from the rest of the world. Marion moved slowly through the main room, taking in the quiet intimacy of it, a blanket folded neatly on a chair, a ceramic mug beside a stack of paperbacks, dried herbs hanging near the window. Every detail held a sense of deliberate care. On the kitchen table lay another envelope, crisp despite the dust around it. In Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "To be delivered to my attorney." Marion stared at it, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and understanding. This wasn't an accident. Eleanor hadn't left her random scraps of her past. She had entrusted her with something purposeful, something enormous, something Marion was only just beginning to grasp. Marion didn't open the second envelope right away. Instead, she carried it outside onto the small porch, needing air before she dealt with yet another secret Eleanor had prepared. The forest around the cabin was silent except for the drip of overnight rain sliding from branches. When she finally pulled out her phone and dialed the number written on the envelope, she half expected no one to answer. But the line picked up almost immediately. Alice Vanderbilt speaking. Her voice was composed, steady, the kind of voice that belonged to someone used to dealing with complex things. Marion introduced herself, explaining who she was and that Eleanor Cole had passed the day before. There was a pause, short but meaningful. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Alice said gently. "And yes, I've been expecting your call." The phrasing sent a ripple down Marion's spine. It wasn't surprise she heard in Alice's voice, but readiness, as though Eleanor had planned this moment with careful precision. Alice continued, "There are instructions we must follow exactly. The reading of the will cannot proceed unless everyone Eleanor named is present. That includes your husband, Alex Cole Jr., and his sister, Stephanie Cole. They must attend." Marion agreed, though her mind tightened at the thought. That evening, when Alex finally came home and Stephanie arrived not long after, Marion tried to explain. She told them Eleanor had left instructions, that the attorney needed all of them in the same room. Alex chuckled under his breath. Stephanie rolled her eyes dramatically. "A will." Stephanie scoffed. She had nothing. What's there to read? Old sweaters and mystery novels. Alex added, Mom lived off Social Security and complaints. Don't build this up, Marion. They laughed together, dismissing Eleanor's life, her death, and everything in between. Marion said nothing. She didn't tell them about the cabin hidden deep in the Quinault rainforest. She didn't mention the key that had turned so smoothly in the lock. She didn't reveal the second envelope sitting untouched on the kitchen table up there, meant only for attorney Alice Vanderbilt. She simply watched them, realizing quietly that the two of them had no idea what was coming. And for the first time, Marion wasn't afraid of that. Alice Vanderbilt's office sat on the fourth floor of an old brick building in downtown Tacoma, overlooking the gray stretch of Pacific Avenue. The conference room where everyone gathered that morning felt too bright for the occasion, sunlight filtering through tall windows, reflecting off polished wood and neatly stacked files. Marion took a quiet seat near the end of the table, hands folded in her lap. Alex and Stephanie arrived together, bickering about parking before plopping into their chairs with impatient sighs. Two elderly women, Eleanor's longtime friends, sat nearby, clutching their purses with a kind of nervous reverence. Marion remembered seeing their faces in a few framed photos Eleanor had kept by her bedside. When Alice entered, the room fell into a respectful silence. She greeted everyone with a firm nod before placing a thick folder in front of her. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "We're here to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Cole." She was very clear about how she wished this process to be handled. Stephanie leaned back, arms crossed. "Let's just get on with it." Alice didn't react. She opened the folder and began reading. "To my son, Alex Cole Jr., a slight smirk touched Alex's face. I leave forgiveness, and nothing else." The smirk collapsed. A stunned laugh escaped him, half disbelief, half wounded pride. Alice continued without pausing. "To my daughter, Stephanie Cole, I leave the wedding ring she once admired and tried to take. May it remind her that promises still matter." Stephanie's jaw tightened, her face draining of color. "To my dear friends Margaret Holt and Diane Weaver, I leave financial gifts in recognition of their years of loyalty and kindness." The two women exchanged teary glances, whispering quiet thanks. Then Alice lifted her gaze to Marion. "And to Marion Cole I leave everything else. The cabin property, all remaining savings, personal belongings, and the insurance benefits." The room seemed to inhale sharply. Alex shot to his feet. "This is a joke," he snapped. She was confused. Someone manipulated her. Stephanie joined in, her voice sharp and trembling. "We'll take this to court. She must have been coerced." Alice remained composed. She reached for another envelope within the folder. "Eleanor anticipated your reaction. She underwent a full psychiatric evaluation 1 week before signing this will." Alice slid the certified report across the table. "It confirms she was fully competent." Alex's anger flickered, but he held on to it. "And," Alice added, producing a small flash drive, "she recorded a video explaining her decisions. If necessary, it will be presented to the court." Silence fell. Thick, heavy, undeniable. Alex slowly sat back down. Stephanie looked away, blinking hard, her bravado evaporating. In that moment, the illusion of their entitlement shattered completely. And Marion, quiet, steady Marion, felt the weight of Eleanor's trust settle firmly into her hands. The moment Alice closed the folder, the room's uneasy silence fractured. Alex shoved back his chair so hard it scraped against the floor, muttering curses under his breath. Stephanie followed, her heels striking sharp, angry notes as she stormed toward the hallway. The door slammed behind them, leaving the office abruptly quiet. Only Marion and the two elderly friends remained seated, their shock still settling in. Margaret and Diane whispered soft condolences before excusing themselves, their faces full of sympathy for someone who had never truly been treated as family. When the door clicked shut behind them, Alice turned to Marian with a softened expression. "There's one more thing," she said. From her desk drawer, she retrieved a small, worn envelope, handwritten, addressed solely to Marian. The paper looked older than the others, as though Eleanor had sealed it long before she ever entered the hospital. Alice offered it with both hands, almost ceremonially. "She asked that I give this to you after the will was read," Alice explained. She was very specific. Marian hesitated, then opened the envelope. A single line, written in Eleanor's unmistakable script, stared back at her. "Forgive no one. Let them come crawling. When they do, smile and turn away." The words felt heavier than the key Marian had found in the cabin. Heavier even than the inheritance that had turned Alex and Stephanie into enemies. This message wasn't legal instruction. It was emotional legacy, raw, unfiltered, and painful in its honesty. Alice watched her carefully. "Eleanor didn't choose you because you were the easiest choice," she said quietly. "She chose you because you were the only one who stood by her without asking for anything. All of this was her final act of strength, and she wanted you to carry it." Marian folded the letter with trembling fingers and slipped it into her coat. When she stepped out into the cool Tacoma air, the weight of everything settled over her fully. She hadn't asked for this responsibility, but now it belonged to her alone. The cabin felt different when Marian returned, no longer mysterious, but quietly expectant, as though it knew she had unfinished business waiting inside. She closed the door behind her and let the silence settle before climbing the narrow staircase to the attic. The boards creaked beneath her weight, sending small echoes through the rafters. Dust drifted in soft beams of light as she pushed open the attic door. The space was cluttered but organized, filled with old trunks, wooden crates, and shelves lined with neatly labeled boxes. It was clear someone had spent years preserving every detail of a life no one else had bothered to ask about. Marian opened the first box. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, postmarked decades apart, some crisp, some yellowed with age. Another box held journals, dozens of them, their spines worn from use. She carried an armful downstairs and set them on the old kitchen table. The first journal she opened began with Eleanor's elegant handwriting, steady at first, then gradually more fragile as the years progressed. Page after page unfolded a life marked not by dramatic tragedies, but by the slow erosion of being overlooked. She wrote about the years after her husband passed, how the holidays blurred into one another, how she set the table out of habit even when she knew no one would come. She wrote about calling Alex on Thanksgiving and getting his voicemail for the 6th year in a row. She wrote about Stephanie visiting only when she needed money, leaving quickly afterward, pretending not to notice the loneliness clinging to the walls. There were entries that chilled Marian, short, painful lines written late at night. "I heard families laughing outside today. I used to have that once. I wash the good plates, even though no one is coming." And then, inevitably, "Maybe the children aren't cruel. Maybe I'm simply unnecessary." Marian felt her throat tighten. Near the bottom of one crate, she found a small envelope marked in a different hand, firmer, distinctly masculine. Inside was a letter from Eleanor's late husband, written years earlier. "If you're reading this, it means I am gone. Nadine, do not reward the ones who abandoned you. Leave your heart to those who truly deserve it, even if it is not our children." Marian sat motionless for a long time, the letter resting in her lap. The weight of Eleanor's choices that once seemed harsh, now made devastating sense. The will, the instructions, the secrecy, none of it had been born of bitterness. It had been born of a lifetime of silent suffering. And Marian finally understood. Eleanor hadn't been seeking revenge. She had been seeking justice for a heart that had been forgotten far too many times. A few days after Marion finished sorting through another stack of Eleanor's journals, a sharp envelope slid through the mail slot of her Tacoma home. The official seal on the front made her stomach drop before she even opened it. Inside were court papers. Alex and Stephanie were formally contesting the will, claiming Eleanor had been manipulated, coerced, and mentally unfit when she signed her final documents. Marion sat at the kitchen table, the accusation blurring in her vision for a long moment. She had expected anger, resentment, maybe even more threats, but seeing their claims in legal print stirred a deeper ache. They weren't just rejecting Eleanor's decisions. They were erasing her entirely. She called Alice immediately. "I received something," Marion said quietly. "I assumed you would," Alice replied, calm as ever. Eleanor anticipated this. She prepared for it far more thoroughly than you might realize. The reassurance steadied Marion, but it didn't erase the dread curling into her chest. A day later, Marion met Alice in her downtown office. A neatly arranged folder lay open on the attorney's desk, filled with documents Eleanor had insisted be kept ready. "She left recordings," Alice said, tapping the stack of labeled flash drives. Every visit, every conversation, every moment she felt dismissed or ignored. All dated, all verified. Marion blinked. Recordings? Yes, legally framed, with her consent established in each entry. Washington state's two-party consent laws can be complex, but Eleanor followed procedure. Alice gave a small, knowing smile. She wanted the truth preserved. When the court date arrived, the Pierce County courtroom felt colder than Marion expected. Alex sat beside his attorney, jaw tight, eyes fixed anywhere but on Marion. Stephanie sat a row behind, arms crossed, bitterness radiating like heat. Alex's attorney opened with sweeping declarations about diminished capacity, emotional vulnerability, and the supposed influence Marion had over Eleanor. He painted Eleanor's final months as a blur of confusion and weakness. Then Alice stood. She presented the psychiatric evaluation dated 1 week before the will's signing. Clear, direct, unequivocal. Eleanor had been fully competent, fully aware, and fully intentional. Next came the audio logs. The judge listened to recordings of Eleanor's voice, soft but steady, as she described Stephanie's rare visits, Alex's long silences, holidays spent alone, and her growing certainty that her children cared only for what she could offer them financially. Finally, Alice submitted Eleanor's recorded explanation, filmed on her phone, a simple message stating why she had chosen Marion and why her children would not receive anything more than what she felt they had earned. By the end, the judge's expression had hardened. The ruling came swift and without hesitation. The contest was dismissed. The will stood exactly as Eleanor intended, and Alex and Stephanie were ordered to pay the legal costs in full. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Marion felt something shift inside her, not relief, not triumph, but a quiet recognition that truth had finally spoken for itself. News of the dismissed will contest traveled quickly through Tacoma. Within a week, a short but pointed article appeared in the Tacoma Tribune, summarizing the case in a few clipped paragraphs. It mentioned the siblings' attempt to overturn their mother's will, the court's swift rejection, and the judge's ruling that they pay all legal costs. The tone was restrained, but anyone reading between the lines could sense the humiliation. The article rippled through the social circles Alex and Stephanie depended on. Neighbors who once chatted easily with Stephanie began avoiding her, suddenly too busy or too distant to engage. At her workplace, co-workers shifted subtly. Conversations paused when she entered the break room. Invitations stopped arriving in her inbox. No one said anything openly, but the change was unmistakable. People preferred not to be associated with someone who had tried to strip her own mother's last wishes for personal gain. Alex faced a harsher fallout. His construction business, already shaky, began unraveling rapidly. Several banks withdrew loan offers once they realized Eleanor was no longer alive to act as guarantor. Clients pulled out of contracts, unwilling to gamble on a company losing its financial anchor. Within a month, his office downsized. A month after that, 2 employees quit. Alex's anger grew loud and unfocused, but nothing he did held the collapse back. Through it all, Marian stepped quietly out of their shared home. She packed only essentials and drove back to the forest cabin, Eleanor's cabin, letting the quiet wilderness become her temporary refuge. The air there felt clearer, as though it carried none of the bitterness and tension she left behind in Tacoma. She settled into the cabin with a sense of grounding she hadn't felt in years. The creak of old floorboards, the scent of cedar and lavender, the soft hum of wind in the trees, it all formed a sanctuary around her. In the evenings, she reread the note Eleanor had written. Forgive no one. Let them come crawling. When they do, smile and turn away. Only now something inside her shifted. The words no longer struck her as harsh. They felt truthful. There was no guilt in her anymore, only clarity and the quiet strength Eleanor had trusted her to carry. Life in the forest settled around Marian slowly, like soft moss covering an old stone. Each morning, she walked through the cabin's rooms, feeling the quiet warmth Eleanor had left behind. But as the days passed, she began sensing something more, an unfinished intention woven into everything Eleanor had preserved. The journals, the neatly kept shelves, the way the cabin felt prepared rather than abandoned. Eleanor had wanted this place to hold life again. One afternoon, Marian sat on the porch watching sunlight filter through the trees when the realization came with gentle certainty. Eleanor had built this space for more than solitude. She had built it for renewal. Marian picked up her phone and called Alice. I want to turn the cabin into something meaningful, she said. A place for people like Eleanor, people who feel forgotten. Alice didn't sound surprised. Eleanor spoke often about wanting her home to help others. If you're ready, I can guide you through the nonprofit process. Over the following weeks, Marian met with Alice several times in Tacoma. They filed paperwork, completed background checks, navigated Washington State's nonprofit registration, and coordinated inspections to ensure the cabin met safety requirements. Marian scrubbed floors, repaired window frames, replaced aging light fixtures, and repainted the exterior with the help of a few kind neighbors from Lake Quinault. Bit by bit, the cabin transformed, not into something new, but into what it had always been meant to be. When everything was finally in place, Marian stood in the doorway beneath a freshly carved wooden sign. The House of Hope word spread quickly through nearby towns. On the day of the grand opening, cars lined the narrow road leading to the property. Dozens of locals stepped inside, widows who rarely received visitors, older men who lived alone since their children moved away, neighbors who had become invisible in their own homes. They filled the cabin with soft conversation, warm hands, and careful laughter. Marian greeted each person, offering tea, hugs, or quiet moments by the fireplace. She felt Eleanor's presence everywhere, in the sunlight on the walls, in the scent of lavender, in the tender way strangers opened up as if they sensed they were finally seen. Margaret, one of Eleanor's old friends, approached Marian with watery eyes. You know, she said, taking Marian's hands, you're like a continuation of Eleanor. The word struck deep, blooming into something steady inside Marian's chest. She looked around the lively room, the knitting circle forming near the window, a man playing soft melodies on an old guitar, 2 widowed sisters sorting through donated books. Eleanor had dreamed of this, and Marian realized with a soft, grounding certainty that she had become exactly what Eleanor hoped she would be, a guardian of the forgotten, a keeper of sanctuary, a living extension of the woman who had trusted her most. The first real cold snap of the season settled over the Quinault Rain forest the morning Alex arrived. Frost clung to the wild rose bushes lining the path, and the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Marian had been stacking firewood outside the cabin when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her coat as Alex stepped out of his car. He looked nothing like the man who had once dismissed his mother's death with a shrug. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his eyes restless and sunken from nights spent without sleep. He approached the cabin gate with a mix of urgency and defeat. "Marian," he called out, voice cracking. "We need to talk." She walked toward the gate, but did not open it. She stood on the inside, hands resting calmly on the wooden latch, the boundary between them as firm as the cold air that separated their breaths. "What is it, Alex?" she asked. He glanced around, shivering. I need help. $5,000. Just until things settle." His voice wavered, slipping between anger and desperation. "You have it. She left everything to you." Marian kept her expression steady. I can't help you." Alex's jaw tightened. "So that's it? You shut me out because she favored you? Because you got the house, the money, everything." His voice rose, brittle and splintering. "You've become cold, Marian. Unrecognizable." For a moment, Marian almost pitied him. But pity wasn't what she felt, not anymore. She stepped closer, still refusing to open the gate. "Your mother loved you," she said quietly, "more than you ever realized. But you didn't love her back. Not when it mattered." She paused, letting the truth settle. "And you don't get to rewrite that now." Alex shook his head, anger returning. But it was hollow, directionless. "You think you're better than me now." "No," Marian replied, her voice even, steady as the frost beneath their feet. "I just stopped being convenient." Alex stared at her, breath fogging in the cold. Disbelief mingled with something darker, recognition. A truth he could no longer avoid, no matter how loudly he denied it. She stepped back from the gate, signaling the end of the conversation. "You should go, Alex. There's nothing here for you." For a long moment he didn't move. He simply stood there, surrounded by the quiet forest, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. Then he turned, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Marian standing in the sharp morning cold, unshaken, resolute, and finally completely free. 1 year later, the Quinault Rain forest felt different, not quieter, not louder, but fuller. The House of Hope had become a small but steady heartbeat in the community. Every week, people who had once lived in isolation found their way to the warm glow of the cabin's windows. On Tuesdays, Marian hosted weekly dinners. Long tables filled the main room, set with mismatched plates Eleanor had carefully collected over the decades. Widows from the nearby towns brought homemade pies. Elderly veterans shared stories they hadn't spoken aloud in years, and neighbors who had once kept to themselves lingered long after the dishes were cleared. Laughter rose gently into the wooden beams, softening the sharp edges winter often brought. Fridays became game nights. Card decks slid across the table. Checkerboards clicked with quiet strategy, and old rivalries formed in the most harmless, joyful ways. Marian moved between groups, offering tea refills and warm blankets to those with stiff hands, her presence grounding and steady. And then there were the silent Sundays, hours dedicated to reflection, reading, knitting, journaling, or just sitting by the window as rain tapped against the panes. For many, it became the most cherished ritual. For Marian, it was a reminder that quiet didn't have to mean loneliness. With each passing month, she felt something new take root inside her, a sense of belonging she had never truly known. Not because she ran the place, but because she was part of it. People sought her out not to take from her, but to share something real, something human, something healing. When the first anniversary of Eleanor's death approached, Marian planned a small memorial. That evening, dozens gathered outside the cabin. The dark Washington winter pressed close, but the light from the candles they held pushed it back. Flames flickered in cupped hands as Margaret, Diane, and several others shared memories of Eleanor. Some tender, some humorous, all deeply felt. Marian stepped forward last. She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. Everything she would have said was already living in the walls of the cabin, in the faces illuminated by candlelight, in the quiet unity of a community Eleanor had unknowingly built the foundation for. Later that night, Marian returned inside and sat at her small writing desk. Her manuscript, the letter that gave me strength, lay complete. A book shaped from Eleanor's journals, her letters, her grief, and her quiet resilience. A story that belonged to both of them. Before going to bed, Marian walked out to the old oak behind the cabin. Its branches curved overhead like a sheltering embrace. She touched its rough bark, the forest whispering around her. "You weren't forgotten," she murmured into the cold night air. "And now, neither am I." The wind carried her words upward, settling them gently into the evergreen canopy where they belonged.